Namaste Sharam Kiyaram Oyaramane Oyaram Iyara Iyara Thank you. Iyara Mm. 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 Manimir Sharap Sakurat Setia Mamir Shafterat Kiara, Kiara, Irushaftadakari, Murusharama, Murushnenerasakurat, Murashkaramana, Kiara, Kiara, Kiara. Mm. 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 Liberos teratacum sadiarash. Ma, ma, ma. Giramasnanaras teransha. Mosnimerit shititaros takarat. Mana, mana, mana. Miramastir ansharas. Mana, mana. Si Pitru Sanimir Satyan. Mafara Sakala Pirshana Morotiet. Kias Nimoros Shanafte. Niyama. Niyama. Stir shota prati mat iro prati ene. Sifti piara shofta paramadekti pistoro katitri tadamian sat. Makaranini shara tofloro katit iara. Mansoro shefterat akadamet ishafarak. Karab sharat adarin ifti piro kaninish. Shiram safarama fokaratiniam. Yerbefti Purusha Taparamafti Karat Idirat Adana Sakaramitri Shakadatir Mishin Ifti Parakanimishan Sadikanam Saduk Hid Enirat Animurat Sadif Terat Sorotash Tadayamak Kadipurmasafana Mashanani Darat Kasi Professionamafti Kadish Dayarat Shish Terasafoma Sakrote Semiftirate Kana rapafte pokora pakatini ifti pürüştü kudarat ifti pürüştü ağda. Kista flamoroştu ifti poro pakatini ifti ana. Sienni arafte petoro fatakadini sheni. Orapate peteni arate kapukorati mishe. Niyamas takarat siaratisha kamukaratitiman. Siya faparabastaftamanishta tikratanishtiarasa. Katini mir tatore temera pesiftim taratakomasha. Kia pokaramasati tershaman. Tie trufte paro katini efti petreshafti petram aman. Akarama at ifti petrishta tapani yeshaman. Si peterishta kuramat fatapakarat temera toka. Isafa masokatiniashta masokinirat eshk. Man. 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 Ima poro fatavamas. Skidemora sunimur patem. She a vidro shadanaram katan. Ne barasaf diminish. Anent enu mushtarat katem. Ishkarani no sani derush. Kamastini arashaftem. In essa provocati missionária tonia, catitiste teremocossone, pedeshani, onomaseste petrofonimisht. Si domani shtaratafte pokolarustati, fiotokarasnit ishtopani, krosa, catitish, takarat iniftitish, saramash. Io fumo tokaramishai, come se te morosum, io terapokatarni, shite porofam sit. Kite damana shati trakwam siti nefte pedorot takadenish te patera shkatorom shinia takara siti binaraf te porom shat mafta takarat stine shiperom softe mataranan takarish te tetaran te porom asate kinimi te ash te poroma shitina mas te pokora posek te tamash te irim te tamash makadi pro te mashte Kiti te manada se pati poroma se pita najda kati pita reshati pima efti pita ana kati stari pita zonet pihara kati shta u kati barat manada shta kara pita tim ana kati irini shte tem kul kuti sa ma ha mm, 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 Spit out the risotto as is customary. They all seem like some of the ceremonies that people do with spirits. No, I used to work with a Babawa in Nigeria who would like sometimes do offerings with libations for me. And sometimes he would send me videos and he would be like drinking pretty regular beer and then just like, and then sometimes he would get a gun and he would like shoot it into the sky. That was pretty cool. And I remember I was like cold to ask him not to use any animal products in any of the spells. And one time he sent me a video and there was like a dead lizard. And I was like, I won't use his name, but I was like, I thought I asked you not to use any animal products. And he was like, it was already dead. And the first time I asked him not to use any animal products was because he sent me a video where they were like killing a chicken as an offering. It's very powerful magic in my opinion. Anyway, welcome to Why Am I Like This 2023, August the 18th. I'll say what I usually say at the beginning of Why Am I Like This, which is the guarantee that I'm called to make on behalf of my vaster self, Nobu the Elder, or Red Star Green Cloud, the soul complex of the heart chakra of Sirius, or the being sometimes known as Sekhem, in the heart chakra soul complex of a few different star systems outside of our galaxy, is that I will not create or allow for the creation of any karma. I will not reify or allow for the reification of any karma, and that I would only allow for the resolution and or the ripening of karma in this container. And I welcome anybody to let me know if they feel like the guarantee has been breached in any way. I'm not going to go off of any questions which have been offered to the Why Am I Like This container before this container, but I'd love to hold space for any questions that anybody has. V asked how you're all doing. I already answered that as a joke, but I'm doing quite well. Thank you for asking. Does anybody else have any questions? Does anybody want to answer these questions? No, sorry, V. I feel like y'all can unmute. You can definitely text. Got some answers to the questions in text. Okay. Well, y'all can answer in text, and I'm gonna continue doing whatever's gonna happen in this container. So a couple of days ago, I went to a town called Bilana on, I would say, like the eastern coast of Lake Como, but I'm not sure if that's correct terminology. And I posted something on Twitter about my initial encounter with this place on a map. And I guess I'm going to talk a little bit about that first. And then I'll talk about Bilana. And then I'll talk about mountains, trees, and rivers, and false gods. So the first time I encountered this place called Bilana was during what I'm feeling called to name as the June solstice of 2021, also known as the summer solstice in the Northern Hemisphere, which is also the winter solstice of the Southern Hemisphere, which is where I was born. And I had felt called to do a ritual with the spirit of psilocybin, cumin, sage, marjoram, I think apple cider vinegar. Could say, I want to say like the filtered water of a spring on the eastern seaboard. And a couple of spiritual acquaintances. I'd say like one of them is somebody I'm still friendly with, and another one of them is probably somebody who does not like me very much. But yeah, basically I made a tea with representatives of the spirits that I named earlier, and we steeped it and we drank it, and we were sitting down, and I got this sense to talk about like shared past lives that I had with one of these people who I feel I can call Michelle. And at the time I kind of had this sense, and then I felt like I should check that sense with my body, which is a habit that I fell into. My internet connection's unstable. um, did I get disconnected for y'all? And if so, can you let me know where I should pick up? Or like, what's the last thing you had? All good? Okay. Yeah, so I'd gotten some sense about shared past lives with a friend named Michelle. And at the time, I'd fallen into the habit of checking things with my body 3 times, which is something I learned from a practitioner whose name is Manasa Saragu, which I put in the chat because I feel like she's a really solid practitioner. And she'd ask me to check everything with my body 3 times. So basically, I would ask myself, originally, I would ask my body to show me yes, and I'd feel into it. And then, actually, she did not tell me that I should ask my body 3 times. That's something I learned from another practitioner named Mars, Luxa Gabe. She called it like the law of 3, and I asked my body 3 times, and my body said, yeah, it's like a real thing. So I started asking my body 3 times. And I learned that essentially it's kind of arbitrary, but it's sort of like a law within, I would say, our solar system, that if you get 3 answers which are incorrect for a question from a spirit, then that spirit ends up incurring a lot of karma. And I would say that this is kind of like a security protocol to make sure that spirits only lie to us when, you could say, they've like considered the consequences of doing it. So I'm not going to say that I haven't gotten 3 answers which are like yes, and then it's turned out to be like a no in actuality for whatever I was asking. That's definitely happened to me, but I would say that there was some sort of karmic penalty for that. So I challenged something about past lives with Michelle. I asked my body 3 times if it was correct, and then I started talking. And what I told her is that my sense is that we had shared an incarnation named Simona, and that she was a witch, and that she had had a son whose name was Giorgio or Giorgietto, and that he was also a witch. And then I felt called to pull out my phone and open Google Maps and go to like Italy on my phone. And I was like checking my body 3 times on all of this. And I felt like I was basically just moving around the map until my body started to like resonate. And yeah, I guess I asked this question on Twitter as well. And I don't think anybody responded, but I feel like I need to ask if anybody is familiar with anything like this happening to them. Quiet today, huh? Either you can't hear me because my internet connection's still unstable and nobody feels like talking. Okay, well, basically, I went to this part of the map and my body was like, "Nyeh." And the part of the map I went to was Bolano. And we were just like sitting there, kind of gently sipping the tea, which is something I could recommend in general. And I was basically getting downloads about what had happened to Simona and Giorgetto. And what I understood, and what I checked with my body 3 times, is that she was a witch. She'd raised him as a witch. They lived in somewhat of a community of witches, and that Giorgio had been tortured by soldiers of the Holy Roman Empire after having been found guilty of, I'm going to say, trigger warning, sodomy. And that basically he had died in this place. So a couple of days ago, well, about a week ago, my wife and I were like in Milan thinking about getting out of town. It's like August right now, and I would say like a lot of things are pretty like quiet because a lot of people go on vacation. So we were just thinking about getting out of town. It's also really hot here. And my wife suggested going to Verona. And by this time I'd basically like forgotten all about Milan. And I felt called after checking my body 3 times to open up the map. And I looked at Verona, and then I realized that I'd been looking at this map before. And then I remembered this experience with Michelle during the June solstice of 2023. And I was asking myself, like, what was the name? What was the name of the place that I had found? And then I heard the word Bell. So I searched for Bell. And there are all these places around called Bell because it's a pretty common route. And then I couldn't find anything on Lake Como. And I was like, what's going on? Maybe what I had channeled was wrong. Like maybe it never happened. Maybe it wasn't anywhere near Lake Como, et cetera, et cetera. And I was like, okay, that's fine. And then I looked at the map of Verona and I realized that Belano was the next town north on the coast of Lake Como. I'm just going to type the name of it into the chat. I don't know why. If you ever see me going like this, it's because I'm asking my body 3 times whether I should do something or I should have done something, or I'm just asking my body a yes/no question. And this is kind of like how my body shows me yes. So if I ask myself if my name is Noble, I get yes. And if I ask myself if my name is Noble, and then I try to like not move, it kind of hurts. And then I let myself go and I get a yes. And I'd say that like I don't do this for like every little thing anymore because I kind of can't not move. I feel if like my vaster body wants this part of its vaster body, which is my body, to move, and I can't move if my vaster body doesn't want my body not to move. But sometimes I'll still ask my body 3 times if something feels kind of weird. And I feel like this is at this point kind of like a coping mechanism. Like it's something that I could release. That was my body telling me I can release it 3 times. But generally, if I feel like I can sense like some kind of unresolved karma which is ready to be released, I'll ask if I can release it and I'll get 3 yeses. And my sense is also that I don't have to do that anymore, but it's just something that I do, and I'm dismembering myself now. But anyway, I found out that Belano was just north of Verona, and we decided that we were going to go to Belano. And then on Friday, we caught the train there. And I'll say that the entire time I was, like basically the entire day, my body was super activated, and especially like this part behind, I would say like from like Fengmen, which is like the wind gate in acupuncture terms, up into the zeal point, which is like kind of like a little knob on the back of the head. I'm not sure if everybody has it, but it's sort of like where the spine goes into the base of the skull. That's the zeal point. Like this entire part of my body was like almost rigid because I was running a lot of energy. I would say that like a lot of demons were coming at me through other people, which I'm sure for a lot of people are going to like hear that and they're going to say, this person is crazy. This person is just blaming other people's behavior for the difficulties that they're having navigating the psychic realms, et cetera, et cetera. But as far as I can tell, it's true. And I was about to ask my body 3 times if it was true, but I didn't. And I will now, and I'll get 3 yeses. So we got to like we got to Balano. There were a lot of like really challenging interactions. And then we got to the beach. And then like basically like while I was I'll say like while my wife was swimming, I felt cold to like leave the beach and go to the mouth of the river. But I didn't do it until she got back because thieves. And then when she did get back, I got up, I walked to this bridge which went over basically to the mouth of the river. And then I felt cold again, like my body kind of like felt like it had to move to the right. And I found myself looking at a mountain. And then I moved my body to the left and I found myself looking at a church. And then at that point, I got the gnosis that this was the church where Giorgio had been like tortured and had died. And I felt myself cold to start channeling. And I was singing and moving my hands and doing like this thing. And of course, people were looking at me. There were like some like older, I want to say like German tourists underneath, kind of weird. And there were plenty of like old Italian dudes looking at me weird. And I want to say that like Milano seems to be like a very Christian town. I wouldn't say that Milan feels like that, but Milano definitely feels like that, where, you know, there's a lot of like crucifixes everywhere and a lot of like crosses in the ornamentation of the buildings. And like as I was channeling, I was definitely transmuting fear around doing wacky shit in public. But everything was fine. And then while I was channeling, I got some neuroses that I want to talk about in this container. Yeah, does anybody have any questions so far? I've been asking my body why I ask if anybody has any questions at various breaks in what I'm channeling. And I've also asked my body if it's about recuperating capacity so I can continue going. And I feel like the answer is no. I think I've gotten a couple of questions, but I would like to get more questions. So basically, like my sense of what I was channeling was a spell to dismember. I'll just say like the Catholic Church, or I guess like what it often comes through to me as the Holy Roman Empire or the Imperial See, like C as in like SEE. Yeah, Anna said casual, and I'm like, yeah, that seems like a really big thing to like make a claim about. But I feel like in the last container of Why Am I Like This, I talked about what it means to dismember vasta thought forms. And I talked about how I feel like the vasta body, which I'm a part of, is what's really like dismembering these thought forms, and how I feel that many beings who are connected in some way to these vasta beings are also dismembering these thought forms. And yeah, you know, it can kind of come up in ways that feel like purging. So like if you find yourself like having like thoughts come up, and you don't necessarily know where they're coming from, I would say is often because we're basically like beaming awareness through unresolved karma, and some of that tends to go towards the programs which are attached to unresolved karma. And then we may get glimpses of what those programs pertain to, but then generally they get like resolved and released. So I wouldn't say it's like only my vessel that's doing it. I would say in this case that it was only Sekhem. But I think a lot of people are connected by aspect, at least, to Sekhem. And as far as like what that means in current time, I would say that I guess like what's kind of coming through to me is that like a critical mass of programming, which is somehow involved in siphoning awareness towards an egregore related to the Catholic Church, is resolved. And that at some point, of course, like many people who are not connected to Sechem haven't at this point like resolved those programs. But my sense is that on the timelines where the thought form complex that I've been calling the Holy Roman Empire or the Imperial See, the thought forms that are part of that complex will have either been turned into symbiotic thought forms or they will no longer exist, because the awareness that goes through the programs that were released by aspects of Sechem are now no longer giving energy to that overall thought form complex. And so the rest of the thought form complex will eventually like no longer be able to siphon awareness, except for like maybe the symbiotic parts. And I guess like what I'll say there is that like I don't sense that like the Catholic Church is going to like go away, but I do feel that what's left of it will be symbiotic in like 300 years minimum, and maybe a maximum of like 800 years, which is a long time. But what I was doing in dismembering this awareness and then pulling the awareness that on the thought forms which exist in the vessels and in the spirits that are attached to the vasta being known as Sechem, Sirius, was basically like giving the awareness back to, I would say, like mountains, trees, rivers, flowers, and basically like all of the life forms that people used to give awareness to before that awareness was given to the Catholic Church on our timeline and on other timelines. Does that make sense? That feels a little bit abstract or complex. But you could say that like if there's all these timelines where mountains, trees, rivers, and then all of the life forms have a certain amount of awareness from humans, then there's all these timelines which come with where the Catholic Church basically like takes awareness from the mountains, the trees, the rivers, and all the life forms that humans used to give awareness to. All of that awareness is basically like going back on all of those different timelines. And the reason that I guess I'm pointing that out is because you could say that Sechem on some level is responsible for the Catholic Church, and then like many other thought forms, but I'm talking about the Catholic Church in this context. And that's part of like the resolution of the karma of Sechem. And I would say that the Catholic Church itself is like pretty far downstream of the karmic interventions that this Vasta being known as Sechem has made upon Earth. And I would say that most of those interventions have not been chaotic, but you could say that knowledge was given to some people on Earth through communion with the star system known as Sirius. And then that knowledge went on to be used by people who ended up creating the Catholic Church. And then because of their actions, many humans stopped giving their awareness or their ashe to all of these, I'll say like earth spirits for short. And that ends up creating timelines where I'll say like all of existence gets swallowed by a massive black hole. And by resolving this karma, you could say that those timelines cease to exist. And then that, you could say that all of the differences in karma between the timelines that won't exist and the timelines that will continue to exist ends up being distributed back to the timelines that will exist. So I feel like that probably makes sense. So I'll just keep talking. And I'll say that the thing that first like struck me, like while I was channeling, is that like the top of the mountain was like here, and then the top of the church was like here. And I was kind of like, okay, that's pretty interesting. Basically like tried to ask my body like what I was supposed to know about this. And, you know, like what kind of came through me was like, oh, like, you know, the church is like a really high point. And by building the church higher, then people stop looking at the mountain. But then I asked my body 3 times and my body was like, no. But I will say that there are many cities, especially in Europe or in old parts of the world, where the place of worship has like some kind of like tower, and then the top of the tower is supposed to be the highest point in the village, and building anything else like higher than that tower is like kind of a burden, which is not the case in like other places. Like in New York, there are many tiny churches and many large skyscrapers. But I feel like, to cut a long story short, which is kind of uncommon for me, I'll say that people like tend to look at high places. And I think elsewhere in this container, and then I'd say like elsewhere in other times, I've talked about how every time we look at something, we give awareness to it. So I think in some ways, it's kind of natural that mountains end up being seen as gods in many lineages, right? You could say that people kind of tend to look at them because they're on the horizon and they're large. And then all the awareness that is given to those mountains gives them a kind of gravity. And then I would say like people who are like sensitive tend to like look at those mountains because their attention or their awareness is pulled by that gravitation of awareness. And then perhaps like in many lineages, I would say in response to this pull to look at the mountain, and then like a pull which comes from the body to, you could say like look upon or gaze upon a mountain in reverence, many lineages decided to like make these mountains like objects of worship. And they would design rituals around making offerings to the mountain in order to please the mountain, based on superstitions which arose where people did stuff in relation to the mountain, and then they observed things that happened and they decided to classify them as good or bad, right? So then when something good happened and they made a connection to something which had happened on the mountain, they would say that, oh, like the mountain is pleased because this thing happened. And then often they would make a ritual out of it. And then if something bad happened and something had happened that they were able to connect to the mountain, then it would say, well, doing that thing is something that displeases the mountain, so therefore it's forbidden, right? And then of course, like when they enact these rituals, or even when they don't do something because of the mountain, then they're giving more awareness to the mountain. You could say that the terma of the mountain, or the energetic power of the mountain, increases. And I would say that in this place, which is now called Belano, and was called Belano in the time of Simona and Giorgio, what had arisen in this place in like the mid 1600s, I want to say, is a culture of what many people call paganism. And the ritual that they had with regards to this mountain was that on solstice in the summer, because I don't think they might have used the term June back then, but at the June solstice, they would go to the mountain and then they would have rituals, and those rituals are sort of, I'll say like euphemistically known as fertility rituals, where I would say they would drink a bunch of wine. I would say that they would probably work with psychoactive substances such as psilocybin. And I'm getting mugwort, and I'm getting St. John's wort, but I don't think that's what they called it. And I don't think they call it mugwort either, because those are Germanic names. Um, but yeah, they would basically go up there and they would have fertility rituals. And my understanding, which is like something I received in the aftermath of having channeled this, was that somebody who had attended one of these fertility rituals had been captured and tortured by soldiers of the Holy Roman Empire. And then he had given the name of Giorgio to these soldiers. And then these soldiers found Giorgio, they captured him and they tortured him. And my sense is that he did not give up the name of his mother, and he died. And the other sense that I picked up on, like during this trip, I would say, is that he was tortured in a way which like caused his heart to explode. And I think people who are familiar with the crucifixion of Jesus maybe have like looked into like how people tend to die on the cross. And like my understanding is essentially that because you have to hold all your weight up, essentially like your rib cage collapses and your heart explodes, and it could explode from exertion. But my sense is that Giorgio's heart exploded from exertion. And essentially my understanding is that when people expire in this way, their souls are not able to ascend, which is why I was resolving karma on behalf of Giorgio. And I guess like the other part of why I felt I was resolving karma on behalf of Giorgio is because my sense is that the soul that inhabited the heart space of Giorgio is one which belongs to many different aspects of Sekha, which I'm connected to. And, you know, I think if you've been following along with Why Am I Like This, then perhaps like you might remember that I've made an equation between the concept of past lives and sky ancestors. And so I want to sort of like double underline that distinction, because as far as I can tell, the space-time which lives in my heart space is not the same space-time which lived in Giorgio's heart space. But I would say that the space-time that lives in my heart space is part of the same subtle organ that the space-time that lived in Giorgio's heart space came from. Does that make sense? And I would say that in order to like remember this organ so that Sehem can be like remembered and Red Star Green Cloud can be remembered and Noba the Elder can be remembered, I basically have to resolve Giorgio's karma so that his space-time can be rejoined with the organ which consists both of our space-times and of course many other space-times or souls. And in doing so, you could say that the space-time fabric of Red Star Green Cloud and many other aspects becomes continuous again versus like jagged. Yeah. So I just want to go back to like mountains as gods, and then of course like trees as gods and forests as gods. And, you know, like from a certain perspective, there is no like reason why humans giving their awareness to these spirits is necessarily cosmic. And you know, humans giving their awareness to a church is necessarily chaotic. And I would say that doesn't mean that there aren't valid reasons in our density of perception, but I would say that from the perspective of these vaster bodies, it's kind of just like, oh, like there are timelines where humans give their awareness to, I would say like organized religions in general, instead of the spirits of the land. And in resolving that karma, those vaster beings notice, I would say, that we're giving awareness on the cosmic timelines to the spirits of the lands. And, you know, I think that like some people maybe who might listen to this might think about like what I was saying about people giving their awareness to mountains. And of course, like many of these cultures which gave their awareness to mountains, just as an example, did things which are morally reprehensible within current time, right? Like many cultures were known to like sacrifice people to mountains or sacrifice animals to mountains. Many people were known to commit suicide by jumping off of mountains. And, you know, within our moral framework in current time, all of this stuff is bad. And I'll say that my vessel feels like it's bad. But I would say that from the perspective of vaster beings, they're bad because they lead to chaotic timelines. And if I have to tune into like how to reconcile like what feels bad from the moral perspective that we have in 2023 and what feels bad from the perspective of vaster beings, you could say that by giving our awareness to organized religions, we have made ourselves unsovereign, because most of these organized religions have taken all of this awareness and turned that awareness into dogma, right? So instead of like, if we sacrifice a cow to the mountain, good things happen, which is also dogma. You could say that the dogma becomes things like, oh, like, you know, we should not have sex before marriage, or we should only have sex for the purposes of procreativity. And it's not to say that like the dogma of sacrificing goats to mountains is not bad, but I would say that for the most part, that does not lead to chaotic timelines. And the reason, well, first I want to say that from the perspective of vaster beings, like there is no reason, right? It's just like what they observe through their connections to vessels who live in our density of perception. You know, we are able to see through the time of our space-time fabric at this density and then make projections about what happens when people do things. And then we're able to say that this is the reason that those timelines are chaotic, or like not doing those things is the reason that these other timelines are cosmic. But TLDR, I'll say that even when people were like sacrificing goats to mountains, they were still giving their awareness to things which actually provide for them. And I think like the very strong gnosis that I was getting during this episode of channeling, not like this episode of the container, is that within organized religions, we're generally giving awareness to things which do not maintain us, right? Like you could say that in highly developed countries, which used to be religious, or which were, maybe aren't religious anymore, and even were founded on religious freedom, you could say that like the principles by which those societies live were mostly dictated upstream by these organized religions. And you could say that like most of these developed societies are basically at a point where they can't maintain themselves. And I'll justify that by saying, we're like vastly over consuming the natural resources that we need to survive on this planet. But I'll also say that like most modern societies are not growing, like they're actually like dying, like, instead of like two people coming together and having two children, or you could say like three people coming together and having three children, net, like that's not happening. So we're not replacing people at the rate that people are dying in modern countries. And most of the time, those modern countries are growing because of immigration. And a lot of the time they're growing due to immigration from countries where people still worship deities which actually maintain them. Is this all making sense? I feel like I've gone like 8 or 9 levels away from what I was started talking, but yeah, what was coming through for me is how mountains give us like rain. So it felt like really important for me to point to the fact that like mountains are not water itself, but because like water evaporates and becomes vapor in the air, and then differences in temperature cause wind to occur because hotter air is lower pressure and colder air is higher pressure. So just as water tends to move from high places to low places, you could say air tends to move from areas of high pressure to low pressure. And then you start to think about trees, right? And trees have leaves and then they provide shade. So then you have like air which gathers underneath trees becomes cooler, and then air which gathers beneath or not beneath trees becomes hotter in the summer. And then that causes like a shift or a wind. And then of course you have like butterflies flapping their wings according to egregores around chaos theory. But a vast orchestration of the influence of many different spirits leads to wind, and then wind tends to push water up mountains, and then as vapor moves up the mountain, it gets colder because of factors that I won't go into right now. But when it's colder, you could say that the water bearing capacity of air lowers, and then the vapor reaches a condensation point, and then it rains. And then because rain comes down the mountain, we have rivers, and because we have rivers, humans were for a very long time able to drink fresh water. And what was also being shown to me is how water, which tends to gather in small lakes or ponds, tends to become poisonous to humans. So like, I feel like I'm trying to talk about like, the collaboration specifically between mountains and trees and rivers, but I feel like this can be extended to many, many different life forms and also like forms which are composed of consciousness, like mountains are composed of many different rocks and trees. Water is itself a consciousness, which I wouldn't call a life form. And these are all life forms that for a long time humans were giving their awareness to. And I would say that on the timelines where organized religion doesn't result in people not giving their awareness to these forms, on the timelines where organized religions don't massacre witches and pagans, then I would say that humans don't come out of alignment with the forces that they give their awareness to. And we don't end up with societies which can't replace themselves. Like they can't have babies as quickly as they're dying. And we don't end up with societies which are consuming natural resources at a rate that they can't be replenished by the consciousness of Earth. And then we don't end up with timelines where people upload their consciousness into computers and things of that nature. And as for how people uploading their consciousness into computers leads to a black hole which swallows all of existence, I'll say that perhaps if anybody's curious about that, they can offer a question to the container of why am I like this? I feel like that's all I'm going to be able to channel for this container today. I want to repeat that if you feel like I've created or reified any karma, or if I haven't resolved or ripened any karma, then I'd love to hear about it. And finally, I'd like to thank you all for joining this container and holding this portal with me. And of course, I'll take the recording and upload it to YouTube, and I will share it in the 000 dojo. And then if ever anybody has questions or any reflections on what I've shared, or any complaints about my guarantee, then I'd love to hold space for them any way you can find me. Thanks again. Happy Mars night, Venus day in Milano time, and I'll talk to you soon.